The curse hit him right below the ribs. He remembered the flash of violent green light. He remembered the smell of burning stone and ozone. He remembered the exact sound Granger made when the ceiling of the atrium came crashing down in the erased future. Draco jolted upward. His lungs pulled in a massive, ragged breath. He clawed at his own chest. His hands scrambled over the fine silk of his sleep shirt, digging into the skin underneath, searching for the jagged tear of dark magic. No blood. No torn flesh. Just smooth, unmarred skin. He was shivering violently. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He threw the heavy green duvet off his legs and collapsed onto the stone floor of the dormitory. Cold. The floor was freezing against his bare feet and palms. He pressed his hands flat against the rough stone, grounding himself. He took a breath. Then another. The air smelled like damp earth and the deep, cold water of the Black Lake. He looked up. The Slytherin 8th year dormitory. Dark wood paneling. Silver trim on the bedposts. The faint, eerie green glow of the lake filtering through the high enchanted windows. It worked. The bargain worked. He pushed himself up against the side of his four-poster bed. His knees shook. He looked at his hands. They were steadying. They were younger, slightly. A year younger. The faint scar on his left thumb from a miscast severing charm in April was gone. He staggered to the calendar pinned to the back of the heavy oak door. September the 1st. Exactly 1 year ago. He let his head fall forward against the cool wood of the door. He shut his eyes. The relief was so absolute, so physically heavy, it made him dizzy. Malfoy, what in the name of Merlin are you doing? Draco froze. He turned around slowly. Theodore Knott was sitting up in the adjacent bed. His dark hair was sticking up in every possible direction. He squinted at Draco through the gloom of the early morning. You're acting like you've seen a ghost. Theo mumbled. He rubbed his eyes and fell back against his pillows. Or a Dementor. Whichever one is louder. Go back to sleep. Draco stared at him. Theo was alive. In the lost timeline, Theo had died in April. He had bled out in a damp safe house while Draco frantically tried to stem the flow with healing spells that weren't strong enough. Draco swallowed hard. His throat felt like dry sand. What time is it? Too early to be having a crisis on the floor, Theo said into his pillow, his voice muffled. It's barely 6 in the morning. Term hasn't even properly started yet. Why are you awake? Just a nightmare. Draco managed to say. His voice sounded hollow. Too calm for the hurricane currently destroying his head. Well, suffer quietly, Theo groaned. Some of us need our beauty sleep to face the absolute horrors of 8th year. I hear we have to share oxygen with Gryffindors. Draco stood up. He walked to the washroom adjoining their dorm. He shut the bathroom door behind him and locked it with a sharp click. He leaned over the sink and looked in the mirror. Pale skin. Grey eyes. The same arrogant, pointed face. He looked exactly the same. Nobody knew. The bargain was absolute. The price of the time-turner ritual was steep, and it was entirely his to bear. He had surrendered the entire year. The tentative post-war truce. The late-night study sessions in the library. The first time she actually laughed at one of his terrible jokes. The first time she let him touch her face. The night in the astronomy tower. The brutal, bloody war that followed. Gone. Erased. He wiped a hand over his face, watching his own reflection in the glass. Carefulness was the only currency he had left. If he slipped and showed her even a fraction of what was inside him, she would run. In this version of reality, to her, he remained the insufferable former Death Eater who had stood by during her torture on his drawing room floor. He was the enemy. Forcing his hands to uncurl from the edge of the sink, Draco flexed his fingers until the joints popped. The freezing water from the brass tap shocked his skin, but it wasn't enough to drown out the noise in his head. He needed to see her with his own eyes, to know for certain she was actually here. Dressing quickly in the gloom, he pulled on black trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a perfectly knotted Slytherin tie, abandoning the heavy black robes for now. He slipped out of the dorm without waking Theo again. The castle was completely whole. It was a shock to his system. The corridors were intact. No blast marks scorching the ancient stone. No crumbled statues of gargoyles littering the hallways. The portraits slept peacefully in their gilded frames, undisturbed by the sounds of hexes and screaming. Draco walked fast. His boots echoed sharply on the flagstones. The air was cool and smelled of pine and floor wax. It was agonizingly normal. He reached the entrance hall. The heavy oak doors to the great hall were pushed wide open. It was early. Breakfast had barely started. A scattering of students sat at the 4 long tables, looking sleepy and subdued. The enchanted ceiling mirrored a pale, cloudy dawn. Draco stepped through the doorway and stopped dead. The Gryffindor table. Halfway down on the left side. A mess of brown curls escaping a haphazard braid. She was reading a thick, leather-bound book, her chin resting in her hand. Hermione Granger. Alive. Draco couldn't move. He forgot how to breathe. She was wearing her school uniform, already perfectly neat despite the early hour. She had a piece of dry toast on a small silver plate beside her, entirely ignored. As he watched, she reached up and tucked a stray curl behind her ear without looking up from the page. It was the most mundane movement in the world. It broke him in half. He just watched her breathe. He counted the rise and fall of her chest beneath her grey jumper. 1, 2, 3. Every breath she took was a victory. Every breath she took was a universe he had brought back for her with his own memories. His right foot moved. A single, involuntary step across the flagstones. The gravity pulling him toward the Gryffindor table was absolute, an urge to drag her out of her seat and press his face into the crook of her neck just to hear her pulse. Instead, he shoved his hands deep into his pockets, locking his fingers into tight fists until his nails bit into his palms. The walk to the Slytherin table felt like wading through deep water. Taking a seat near the high table with his back to the wall, he completely ignored the breakfast appearing in front of him. His entire focus narrowed to the reflection in the polished silver tea urn at the center of the table. She chewed on the inside of her cheek. She was analyzing a difficult passage. He knew that look. He knew exactly what it meant. She was frustrated by the author's logic. In about 2 minutes, she would sigh, drop her hand from her chin, and reach for her quill to make an aggressive margin note. 2 minutes later, she sighed. She dropped her hand. She picked up her quill. She scribbled something furiously in the margin of the heavy book. Draco's chest ached. It was a sharp, physical pain, right where the curse had hit him in the timeline that no longer existed. He knew her soul, and he was a stranger to her. Mr. Malfoy. Draco snapped out of his trance. Professor McGonagall was standing at the end of the Slytherin table. She wore deep green robes and looked tired, but resolute. "Headmistress," Draco said. He stood up immediately, smoothing his expression into a mask of polite indifference. "My office, if you please." "Now," she said briskly. "You too, Miss Granger." Draco's gaze shot to the Gryffindor table. Hermione had looked up at the sound of her name. Her eyes found him across the hall. Cold. Suspicious. Hard. There was absolutely no warmth in her brown eyes. Just a weary hostility. Draco kept his face perfectly blank. He nodded once to the headmistress. He walked out of the great hall behind McGonagall. He heard Granger's fast, purposeful footsteps echoing behind him. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. The spiral staircase to the headmistress's office moved smoothly upward, grinding softly against the stone walls. Draco stood on one side of the moving step. Hermione stood on the extreme opposite edge. She had pressed her back against the curved wall, maximizing the physical distance between them. She smelled like vanilla and old parchment. He shut his eyes for a fraction of a second. He memorized the scent again, letting it anchor him. The stairs stopped. They stepped out into the circular office. It was exactly as he remembered it from a dozen previous visits. The silver instruments whirred and clicked on the spindly tables. The portraits of past headmasters watched them silently from the walls. McGonagall walked around the large wooden desk and sat down in the high-backed chair. She gestured to the two empty chairs positioned in front of her. Hermione took the chair on the left. She sat perfectly straight, her knees pressed tightly together. Draco took the chair on the right. He leaned back slightly, crossing one long leg over the other, feigning a casual arrogance he absolutely did not feel. "I expect you both know why you are here," McGonagall said. She folded her hands on the polished wood of the desk. "The head boy and head girl positions." Hermione said instantly. Her voice was crisp. "Efficient. All business." "Precisely," McGonagall said. "Miss Granger, your appointment is, of course, no surprise to anyone. You are the brightest witch of your age and a hero of the war. Your record is impeccable." Hermione flushed slightly at the praise. She tapped her fingers once against the wooden armrest of her chair. "Mr. Malfoy," McGonagall continued, turning her sharp, calculating gaze to him. "Your appointment is controversial." "I can imagine," Draco drawled. His voice was smooth and dry, practiced over years of hiding his true thoughts. "I'm surprised the Board of Governors didn't riot." Hermione shot him a dirty look. He caught it in the reflection of the glass display cabinet to his right. They expressed severe concerns. McGonagall said dryly, "However, the staff and I believe that true unity in this castle must start from the top. The student body is fractured. We need a visible demonstration of reconciliation. A Slytherin and a Gryffindor. A former." She paused delicately, searching for the diplomatic phrase. "Death Eater," Draco supplied, his tone perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. Hermione flinched. It was just a tiny, involuntary twitch of her shoulders, but he saw it. "A student who made terrible choices and has returned to make amends, McGonagall corrected firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. You will share the heads' dormitories. You will coordinate the lower years. You will patrol the corridors together. You will present a united front at all times. Hermione opened her mouth to protest. She stopped. She tapped her quill, which she was still clutching in her right hand 3 times against her leg. It was her tell. The exact physical habit she fell back on when she was about to concede a point, but didn't want to admit defeat. Professor, Hermione said, her voice tight. Are you absolutely certain this is the best course of action? For the student body? Give an hour. History? I am certain, Miss Granger, McGonagall said. Malfoy and I. Hermione hesitated. She chewed the inside of her cheek again. We do not have a history of successful collaboration. We barely tolerate each other. Then you will forge a new history, McGonagall said. It was an order, not a suggestion. Hogwarts needs to see that moving forward is possible. Draco kept his expression entirely neutral. The irony was suffocating, closing around his throat. He had already forged a history with her. He had lived an entire lifetime with her in a single, desperate year, and now he had to do it all over again, completely blind, starting from absolute zero. Understood, headmistress. Draco said softly. Hermione glared at the side of his head. He could feel the heat of her anger radiating across the small gap between their chairs. Excellent. McGonagall said. She opened a top drawer and pulled out 2 small, shining badges. She handed the crimson and gold one to Hermione. Hermione took it with a small, proud smile, her anger momentarily replaced by genuine pleasure. McGonagall stood up and walked around the desk. She held the silver and green badge in her hand. Draco stood up. He kept his arms rigidly at his sides. He kept his hands locked behind his back as McGonagall pinned the head boy badge to his robes, because if he let his hands free, he knew they would instantly reach for Granger. She glared at him, alive and perfectly furious, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Part 2. The tea-slip up the head's common room was entirely too small. Objectively, it was a perfectly adequate space. High ceilings, a roaring fireplace, dark oak paneling, and 2 plush armchairs separated by a heavy mahogany desk. It was a room built for comfort and prestige. To Draco, it felt like a cage. He sat in the green leather armchair on the left side of the room, exactly 2 feet away from the fireplace. He had spent the entire afternoon establishing invisible boundaries. His books were stacked with severe precision on his side of the desk. His inkwell was placed exactly parallel to the edge of the wood. He was attempting to review the prefect patrol schedules for the first week of term. It was mindless, administrative work. It should have been easy. It was impossible. His eyes kept dragging across the invisible boundary line dividing the desk. Her side was completely empty. She hadn't moved in yet. Draco dropped his quill. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the dull ache of a tension headache building behind his eyes. Acting like a stranger was physically exhausting. He had spent the entire day walking through the castle corridors, maintaining a mask of cold, polite indifference while his chest felt like it was caving in. He had passed her in the courtyard after lunch. She had shot him a withering look. He had nodded curtly and kept walking. It was agonizing. In the erased future, this common room had been their sanctuary. It was where they had argued over irreversible theory until 2 in the morning. It was where she had fallen asleep on that exact green armchair, her head pillowed on a massive tome about restorative charms. It was where he had first kissed her, right in front of that roaring fireplace. Now, it was just a room. The heavy portrait door swung open with a loud thud. Hermione stormed in. She was a hurricane of frantic energy. Her school robes were slightly askew, and her usually neat braid was completely unraveling, with thick brown curls escaping in every direction. She was clutching 3 very large books to her chest, her wand clamped between her teeth, and a rolled-up parchment tucked precariously under her left arm. Draco watched her struggle through the doorway, his heart giving a violent, unhelpful lurch. She dropped the books onto her side of the desk with a heavy slam. The parchment unrolled itself, spilling across his meticulously arranged patrol schedules. She took her wand out of her mouth. "The first years," she announced to the room at large, her voice vibrating with stress, "are absolutely feral." Draco didn't move. He kept his expression perfectly blank. "Good evening to you too, Granger." She jumped slightly, apparently just realizing he was sitting there. She dragged a hand through her messy hair, making it worse. "I didn't see you," she said defensively. She started haphazardly reorganizing her books, shoving them against his neat stack. "I gathered." Draco drawled. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Did a pack of 11-year-olds manage to best the brightest witch of her age? They are completely terrified. She snapped, rounding on him. Half of them are Muggleborns who just found out magic exists, and the castle keeps moving the staircases on them. I spent 40 minutes trying to convince a first-year Hufflepuff that the suits of armor weren't going to eat him. Did you explain that the armor only eats students who fail their exams? Hermione glared at him. "That is not funny, Malfoy. I thought it was mildly amusing." "Well, you have a terrible sense of humor," she retorted, pacing in a tight circle behind her chair. "And we have a problem. The current patrol schedule is entirely insufficient for the lower corridors. We need to double the rounds near the dungeons." Draco picked up his quill. He tapped it once against the parchment. "No, we don't." She stopped pacing. She put her hands on her hips. "Excuse me?" "The lower corridors are fine," Draco said smoothly. He knew exactly what argument she was about to make, because they had had this exact argument a year ago, in a timeline she didn't remember. "You want to double the patrols because you think the Slytherin first years are going to be targeted by the older Gryffindors." Hermione paused, her mouth falling open for a fraction of a second before she recovered, lifting her chin. Given the current political climate in this school, it is a highly logical assumption. "It's a logical assumption," Draco agreed, leaning forward slightly, "but it's wrong. The older Gryffindors aren't going into the dungeons. They're too busy trying to pretend the war didn't happen in the upper courtyards. If anyone is going to start a hexing match in the lower corridors, it's the Ravenclaws." "The Ravenclaws?" Hermione scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous." "They're stressed," Draco said simply. "They lost their entire library wing during the battle. They're completely displaced. Combine that with any WT-level anxiety, and they are currently the most volatile house in the castle." Hermione went completely still. She chewed hard on the inside of her cheek, her mind visibly racing as she processed the information. Draco watched the exact moment she realized he was right. She tapped her fingers against the edge of the mahogany desk. "Fine," she said grudgingly. "You have a point. We'll leave the dungeon patrols as they are and reinforce the library corridors." "Fascinating," Draco murmured, looking back down at his parchment. Granger conceding a point. "I should mark the date on the calendar." "Don't push your luck, Malfoy," she snapped. She started pacing again. It was a frantic, agitated pacing. She walked from the desk to the window, turned sharply on her heel, and walked back to the desk. She was muttering under her breath, ticking off a mental list of tasks on her fingers. Draco tried to ignore her. He tried to focus on the names written on the patrol schedule. It was completely useless. She was pulling all the oxygen out of the room. She was so stressed she was practically vibrating. She hadn't eaten properly at the welcoming feast. He knew that for a fact. She was running on nervous energy and adrenaline, and if she didn't stop moving, she was going to crash. Without thinking, Draco acted. It was pure, unadulterated muscle memory. A habit ingrained so deeply into his bones from the lost timeline that his hands moved before his brain could stop them. He picked up his wand from the desk. He didn't look at her. He didn't break his facade of cool indifference. He simply flicked his wrist toward the small silver tea service sitting on the side table near the fire. The teapot lifted into the air. A delicate porcelain cup floated down to the mahogany desk, landing smoothly on her empty side of the boundary line. The teapot poured a steaming stream of dark liquid into the cup. Draco flicked his wand again. A small jar of honey opened itself. Exactly 2 drops, not 1, not 3, but exactly 2 precise drops fell into the hot tea. A tiny pitcher of oat milk tilted forward. A minuscule splash of white clouded the dark surface. The teapot and the jars returned to the side table. A small silver spoon stirred the tea twice clockwise, then once counterclockwise, before resting neatly on the saucer. Draco reached out, caught the saucer, and pushed it across the invisible dividing line until it rested directly in front of her empty chair. He didn't say a word. He went back to reading his schedule. Hermione stopped pacing. She stood absolutely still on the other side of the desk. The silence in the common room was sudden and deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Draco kept his eyes fixed on the parchment. His heart was suddenly thudding painfully against his ribs. He had slipped completely, and the sudden weight of her gaze pressing against the side of his head told him she knew it. "What is that?" Hermione asked. Her voice was very quiet, stripped of all the frantic energy from a moment before. "It's tea," Draco said, keeping his voice deadpan. He didn't look up. "It's a liquid beverage usually consumed hot. I thought even Gryffindors were familiar with the concept." Hermione didn't rise to the bait. She took a slow step closer to the desk. She looked down at the cup. The steam was rising in a perfect spiral, carrying the sharp, unmistakable scent of peppermint and exactly 2 drops of honey. "I didn't ask for your help, Malfoy," she said, her voice tight, laced with a sudden, intense suspicion. "Nor did I ask for peppermint tea at exactly the temperature I prefer. Stop being surprisingly useful, it's making me anxious." Draco's jaw clenched. He forced himself to casually dip his quill into his inkwell, aiming for absolute nonchalance. "Drink the tea, Granger," Draco said smoothly. "I'm not trying to poison you. I just want you to stop pacing before you wear a hole in the rug. The sound of your shoes is giving me a headache." "How did you know?" she demanded. Draco finally looked up. She was staring at him, her brown eyes dark and incredibly sharp. She wasn't just annoyed anymore. She was analyzing him. She was picking him apart, trying to solve the impossible puzzle of how a boy she despised knew the exact, complicated way she took her tea when she was stressed. Draco met her gaze evenly. He built the walls of his Legilimency high and thick, burying the sheer, desperate panic completely out of sight. "Know what?" he asked smoothly. "That I drink peppermint tea when I'm stressed," she said, her voice dropping lower. "That I take oat milk. That I take exactly 2 drops of honey. No one knows that except Harry and Ron." Draco leaned back in his chair. He let a slow, mocking smirk pull at the corner of his mouth, hating himself for doing it, but knowing it was the only defense he had. "You're not nearly as mysterious as you think you are, Granger," he drawled, letting the arrogant, aristocratic drawl coat his words. "You spent the entire afternoon chewing on the inside of your cheek and radiating anxiety. You smell like old parchment and panic. Peppermint is a standard calming draft substitute. The oat milk is just an educated guess based on the fact that you refused the dairy cream at the feast tonight." Hermione's eyes narrowed. She didn't believe him. He could see the wheels turning in her brilliant, terrifying mind. "And the 2 drops of honey?" she challenged, crossing her arms over her chest. Draco shrugged slightly. A lucky guess. It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. She took another step closer. She reached out and picked up the delicate porcelain cup. The saucer rattled very slightly against the wood of the desk. She took a sip. It was perfect. He knew it was perfect, because he had made it for her 100 times before, in a life she would never remember. She took a sip, her eyes narrowing over the rim of the cup as she studied him like a particularly difficult arithmancy equation. Draco looked back down at his parchment, his jaw locked, realizing he was going to have to be infinitely more careful. Part 3. The catch. The restricted section of the Hogwarts library smelled of crumbling parchment, dust, and deeply forbidden magic. At dusk, the high, arched windows cast long, skeletal shadows across the narrow aisles. Draco loved it. He sat on the floor, his back braced against a towering wooden bookshelf, his legs stretched out in front of him. A single, floating orb of pale blue light illuminated the heavy tome resting on his knees. It was quiet. It was contained. And she was here. Hermione Granger was sitting 3 feet away, entirely surrounded by precarious towers of ancient books. She had commandeered a small, rickety desk at the end of the aisle and was currently attempting to cross-reference 3 different theoretical frameworks on architectural restoration spells. She was completely absorbed in her work. She hadn't spoken to him in 45 minutes. For Draco, just being in her orbit was a balm to the constant, abrasive ache in his chest. He didn't have to talk to her. He didn't have to pretend to hate her. He could just exist in the same quiet space, breathing the same dust, listening to the frantic scratching of her quill. Turning a page of his own book without reading a single word, he watched her absent-mindedly chew on the end of her quill. He watched the way she tucked a loose curl behind her ear, only for it to fall back into her eyes 10 seconds later. He knew her completely, and he was currently using that knowledge to secretly manipulate her study session. Over the last hour, he had been subtly shifting the books she needed into her line of sight. When she muttered a frustrated curse about a missing volume on foundational wards, he had silently slid advanced defensive structures across the floor until it bumped against her shoe. She had looked down, blinked in surprise, and immediately opened it to the correct chapter, assuming she had dropped it there earlier. When she started violently erasing a complex equation on her parchment, He nudged the silver inkwell 3 inches to the left, exactly where she was going to reach for it blindly in a moment. He was orchestrating her environment with terrifying precision, entirely unnoticed. It was the only way he could touch her life without actually touching her. This is completely contradictory, Hermione announced to the empty aisle. She threw her quill down in disgust. It rolled across the parchment, smudging a line of ink. "What is?" Draco asked, keeping his voice deliberately bored. "Goshawk's theory on structural magical integrity," she snapped, turning around in her chair to face him. "He claims that blood magic can be used to anchor the foundational stones of a large castle, but Flitwick's entire curriculum insists that elemental magic is the only stable binding agent over a period of 1,000 years. Draco closed his book with a soft thud. Goshawk is a hack who wrote his treatise specifically to impress a pureblood patron in the 17th century. His entire theory is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of goblin masonry. Hermione blinked at him. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then narrowed her eyes. "How do you know that?" she demanded. "Because I had a very expensive, very boring private tutor when I was 9, Draco lied smoothly. "We spent 3 months on goblin masonry. It's dreadfully dull. Flitwick is correct. Use the elemental binding charms." She didn't immediately turn back to her essay. She continued to look at him, her expression a complicated mix of suspicion and intellectual curiosity. "You've been incredibly quiet," she noted, her voice dropping slightly. "I was under the impression that silence was the mandatory currency of a library, Granger." "You're not usually this cooperative," she pressed, ignoring his deflection. "We've been down here for 2 hours, and you haven't insulted me once. You haven't complained about the dust. You haven't tried to leave." Draco leaned his head back against the wooden shelf, looking at her from under his eyelashes. "I'm exhausted, Granger. Insulting you takes a level of creative energy I simply don't possess today. Consider it a temporary ceasefire." It was a weak excuse. He knew it. She knew it. The air between them felt suddenly thick, heavy with the things he couldn't say and the things she couldn't understand. The hostility that had defined their first few days of term was slowly burning away, leaving something much more dangerous in its place. "Mate, you are absolutely pathetic." The voice came from the adjacent aisle. Hermione jumped, startled. Draco didn't even flinch. He just closed his eyes and prayed for patience. Theodore Knott strolled around the corner of the bookshelf, a thin, velvet-bound book tucked under his arm. He leaned against the end of the aisle, looking down at Draco with an expression of deep amusement. "Not," Hermione said sharply, recovering her composure. "You are not permitted in the restricted section." "I'm perfectly permitted, Granger," Theo said, waving a slip of parchment in her general direction. "Slughorn gave me a parse. He thinks I'm researching rare potions ingredients. I'm actually looking for a book on highly illegal hexes, but don't tell him that." Hermione bristled, her back stiffening. "What do you want, Theo?" Draco asked, his voice flat. "Nothing," Theo said lightly. "Just observing the local wildlife. You know, you're not being subtle at all. I have no idea what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Theo drawled, his eyes dancing with mischief. He looked from Draco, sitting on the floor, to Hermione, sitting at the desk. "I've been watching you for 20 minutes. You've memorized her class schedule, you poured her tea before she sat down on Monday, and just now, You literally pushed a book onto her foot so she wouldn't have to get up to find it. Hermione's head snapped around. She looked down at the copy of Advanced Defensive Structures resting by her shoe. Draco felt a cold spike of genuine panic pierce his chest. "He's hallucinating," Draco said quickly, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "Go away, Theo. You're acting like a stalker." Theo continued, completely unbothered by Draco's glare. He crossed his arms and sighed dramatically. "It's tragic to watch. Really. It's ruining my studying. Just snog her and put us all out of our misery, Malfoy. The tension in the common room is killing my houseplants. Out." Draco snarled, actually pushing himself up from the floor. Theo laughed, a bright, startling sound in the dusty silence of the library. All right. I'm going. Try not to spontaneously combust, the two of you." Theo turned and vanished back into the labyrinth of bookshelves, his footsteps echoing lightly against the stone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Draco stood completely still, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his heart hammering against his ribs. He refused to look at her, fixing his eyes resolutely on a patch of peeling wallpaper across the aisle. "Did you push that book to me?" Hermione asked. Her voice was incredibly quiet. "Not is an idiot," Draco said tightly. "He finds it amusing to invent narratives when he's bored. Malfoy, look at me." He didn't want to. It was the last thing he wanted to do. But the command in her voice was absolute. Draco turned his head. She was looking at him with an intensity that made him want to step backward into the shadows. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even hostile. She was simply trying to solve the puzzle of him. "You knew I was looking for Goshawk," she said slowly, her eyes tracking his face. "Before I even said his name out loud. You had 3 other books by Goshawk open on your desk, Granger," Draco said, his voice completely smooth, his occlumency walls locking firmly into place. It wasn't a difficult deduction. "I'm observant. It's a survival trait." "You're observant," she repeated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. She turned abruptly back to her desk, her movements sharp and agitated. She reached for a massive, leather-bound volume perched precariously at the top of a stack of books on her right. "I'm perfectly capable of finding my own books," she muttered, yanking the heavy volume toward her. It was the wrong move. The sudden shift in weight destabilized the entire tower. 3 heavy books slid violently to the left. They crashed into her favorite ceramic mug, the ugly, chipped blue one she always brought to the library, knocking it clean off the edge of the desk. It happened in a fraction of a second. But Draco was already moving. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the distance. His body simply reacted to a pattern it had memorized a year ago. He knew she was going to pull the book too hard. He knew she always destabilized the stacks when she was stressed about arithmancy. He knew the mug was going to fall before the books even hit it. Draco lunged forward. His hand shot out, entirely bypassing the falling books. His fingers closed around the handle of the blue ceramic mug in midair, a mere 2 inches before it shattered against the stone floor. Silence crashed back into the aisle. Draco froze, crouching next to her chair, his hand completely steady, holding the perfectly intact mug. Hermione stared at the mug in his hand. Then, she looked down at him. Her breath hitched. It was impossible. He was too far away. The mug had fallen too fast. Unless he had started reaching for it before it even fell. "You caught it," she whispered. "Reflexes," Draco said instantly. His voice was hoarse. He stood up slowly, placing the mug back on the solid wood of the desk, far away from the edge. He took a step back, but it wasn't enough. Hermione stood up from her chair. She didn't retreat. She stepped directly into his space. She was so close he could see the faint smattering of freckles across her nose. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. The scent of vanilla and old parchment surrounded him, dizzying and familiar and entirely devastating. She looked up at him, her brown eyes completely unreadable. "You're lying," she said softly. "I'm really not," Draco replied. He forced himself to hold his ground. He didn't step back. He let the proximity burn him. "You knew I was going to knock it over," she said, her voice barely a breath. She tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over his face, searching for the crack in his armor. "You were already moving. You knew exactly what I was going to do before I did it. You are exceptionally clumsy when you're stressed about irreversible, Granger," Draco said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "It's a pattern. You tap your quill, you chew your cheek, and then you knock things over. I simply recognized the pattern." She bristled instantly. Her defensive nature flared up, hot and immediate. "I am not exceptionally clumsy." She shot back, her voice rising slightly. "You just nearly shattered a mug and caused an avalanche of theoretical physics," he pointed out casually. "Because you were distracting me." "I was sitting on the floor in complete silence," Draco countered, raising a single eyebrow. "If my sheer existence is enough to derail your intellectual focus, Granger, you have much bigger problems than Goshawk's theories on blood magic." She made a small, frustrated sound in the back of her throat. She leaned in closer. It was an entirely involuntary movement. An aggressive, challenging lean that brought her face mere inches from his. Draco's breath stalled in his lungs. He could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. He could feel the slight, rapid flutter of her breathing against his collarbone. The air between them suddenly felt charged, snapping with invisible electricity, pulling them together with a gravitational force that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with muscle memory. He wanted to close the distance. He wanted it so badly his hands physically shook with the effort of keeping them at his sides. He wanted to slide his palm to the back of her neck, tangle his fingers in her messy hair, and kiss her until she forgot every single reason why she shouldn't trust him. Her eyes dropped to his mouth. Just for a fraction of a second. Draco's jaw tightened. He leaned in, just a millimeter. Just enough to let her know he saw it. Hermione's breath hitched again, a sharp, audible sound. Reality crashed back into her. The hostility, the history, the war, the boy who made the wrong choices. She flinched. She took a sharp, sudden step backward, breaking the magnetic field between them, pulling her warmth entirely out of his reach. Her eyes were wide, a flash of genuine panic crossing her features as she realized exactly how close she had just been to the enemy. "I have to go," she said quickly, her voice slightly breathless. "I have, or rounds. Perfect rounds." She grabbed her bag from the floor, shoved her books haphazardly into it, and completely ignored the ceramic mug on the desk. She turned and practically fled down the aisle, her footsteps echoing rapidly against the stone floor. She pulled back, the warmth of her breath disappearing from his jaw. Draco didn't move a muscle, letting her retreat, letting her rebuild her walls, because it was the only way to keep her safe. Part 4. The price the cold was supposed to help. Draco stood in the center of the viaduct courtyard, letting the freezing November wind rip through his heavy wool cloak. Snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets, burying the flagstones and piling up against the ancient stone pillars. He tilted his head back, letting the snowflakes hit his face, hoping the ice would numb the agonizing, blinding pain behind his eyes. It didn't work. The migraine had started 3 days ago, a dull thud at the base of his skull that had steadily escalated into a screaming, jagged agony. It felt as if someone was driving a rusted iron spike directly into his brain, right between his temples. It was the timeline. The time-turner bargain was absolute, but the human body was never meant to hold two concurrent realities. His brain was trying to process the erased future, the war, the blood, the exact way she had looked at him in the astronomy tower, while simultaneously forcing itself to exist in the mundane present of 8th year. The temporal friction was literally tearing him apart from the inside out. Draco braced a hand against a frozen stone pillar. His knees buckled slightly. He forced them to lock. He had a perfect patrol. He was supposed to meet Granger at the entrance hall 10 minutes ago to do a sweep of the outer courtyards. He couldn't move. The world tilted dangerously to the left. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the double vision. When he opened them, the snow seemed to be falling upward. A hot, metallic drop fell onto his upper lip. Draco swore softly. He reached up with a shaking hand and wiped his mouth. His leather glove came away stained with a thick, dark streak of blood. Another drop fell. Then another. Leaning heavily against the pillar and sliding down until his shoulder took the brunt of his weight, he fumbled in his pocket for a handkerchief, though his numb fingers refused to cooperate. Going to the hospital wing was impossible. Madame Pomfrey's diagnostic would reveal a temporal tear instead of a standard hex, leading inevitably to McGonagall, the Ministry, and the total collapse of the timeline. He had to fix this himself and just stop the bleeding. He raised his wand with a trembling hand, pointing it at his own face. "Epi-ski," he muttered. Nothing happened. The magic fizzled out at the tip of his wand, weak and pathetic. "Malfoy?" Draco went completely still. The voice cut through the howling wind, sharp and unmistakable. He dropped his wand hand, turning his head slowly toward the arched entrance of the courtyard. Hermione Granger was standing there. She was wrapped in a heavy Gryffindor scarf, her nose red from the cold, a lantern held high in her right hand. The yellow light cut through the falling snow, illuminating the deep frown on her face. "You're 20 minutes late," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "I've been waiting in the entrance hall like an idiot. If you were going to skip rounds, you could have at least." She stopped. She took a step closer, raising the lantern higher. The light caught the side of his face. It caught the blood dripping from his nose, tracking down his chin, and soaking into the pristine white collar of his shirt. Her frown vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sharp, professional alarm. "Malfoy," she said, her voice dropping the accusatory tone completely. She walked quickly across the snow-covered courtyard, her boots crunching loudly. "Stay back, Granger," Draco said. His voice was hoarse. It sounded completely wrong to his own ears. She ignored him entirely. She closed the distance between them in seconds, setting the lantern down on the snowy wall next to him. "You're bleeding," she stated, reaching into her pocket. Astute observation, Draco sneered, trying to inject his usual arrogance into the words. 10 points to Gryffindor. Now go away. Don't be an idiot, she snapped. She pulled a clean white handkerchief from her pocket and shoved it at his chest. Hold this against your nose. Tilt your head forward, not backward. You'll choke on the blood. Draco didn't take it. He kept his hand braced against the pillar, trying to stay upright. The courtyard was spinning in slow, sickening circles. Hermione made a sound of extreme exasperation. She stepped directly into his space. She grabbed his right hand, pried his frozen fingers open, and forced the handkerchief into his palm. Then, she manually pushed his hand up to his face, applying pressure to his nose. Hold it there, she ordered. Her touch was electric. Even through his leather glove and her wool mittens, the sheer physical contact of her hands on his sent a violent shockwave through his system. It made the migraine worse. It made the pain entirely worth it. I don't need your help, he ground out from behind the cloth. Clearly, she said dryly. She didn't step back. She stayed right in front of him, her eyes scanning his face in the dim lantern light. You look terrible. Your skin is grey. It's November. We live in Scotland. You're shaking. It's snowing. Stop deflecting. She commanded. She pulled her wand from her robes. How long has this been happening? How long has what been happening? The nosebleeds. The exhaustion. I've seen you rubbing your temples in the Great Hall for 3 days, Malfoy. Don't insult my intelligence. Draco's heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. She had been watching him. Even when she was glaring at him, even when she was acting like he was a stranger, she had been paying attention. It's just a headache, he lied. A headache doesn't cause you to bleed through your clothes. Hermione pointed out. She raised her wand, pointing it squarely at his chest. Panic flared, hot and sharp, cutting through the fog of pain in his mind. Don't. Draco warned, trying to push himself away from the pillar. He stumbled, his boots slipping on the icy flagstones. Hermione caught him. She dropped her wand to her side and grabbed his upper arm with both hands, steadying him before he could hit the ground. She was remarkably strong for someone so small. Stop moving, she yelled over the wind. You're going to crack your skull open on the stone. Let me go. Draco snarled, trying to pull away. No, she shouted back. She shoved him back against the pillar, pinning him there with a surprising amount of force. You are completely irrational. I am taking you to the hospital wing. I am not going to the hospital wing. Then you are going to let me cast a diagnostic spell right now, or I am going to stun you and levitate you to Madame Pomfrey myself. Draco looked down at her. She was furious, her brown eyes blazing with absolute determination. She meant it. She would absolutely stun him in the middle of a blizzard if she thought it was the right thing to do. He was trapped. If he fought her, he would collapse. If she took him to Pomfrey, the temporal magic would be discovered. He had to let her cast the diagnostic. He had to hope her spell work, while brilliant, wasn't specialized enough in obscure dark arts to recognize a time-turner paradox. Fine. Draco gritted out. He leaned his head back against the cold stone, closing his eyes. Do it. Make it fast. Hermione didn't hesitate. She let go of his arm. She took a half step back, raised her wand, and began the precise wand movements for a standard Mediwizard diagnostic charm. "I don't need Madame Pomfrey, Granger." Draco muttered, the pain in his head pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "I need you to stop shining your wand directly into my retinas." "Shut up, Malfoy," she said, entirely focused. Revelio corporis. A soft, golden light pulsed from the tip of her wand. Normally, the diagnostic spell would wash over the patient, highlighting injuries in faint, color-coded auras. Blue for bruising, red for active bleeding, yellow for magical exhaustion. The golden light hit Draco's chest. It didn't wash over him. It didn't highlight anything. The light hit him and instantly turned a violent, sickening shade of pitch black. The black light flared outward, wrapping around Draco like a shroud. It pulsed with a heavy, unnatural rhythm, emitting a low, vibrating hum that made Draco's teeth ache. Hermione gasped. She took a massive step backward, her wand dropping slightly. The black aura disappeared the moment she broke the spell's connection, leaving the courtyard plunged back into the dim yellow glow of the lantern. Silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind. Draco opened his eyes. He slowly pulled the blood-soaked handkerchief away from his face. Hermione was staring at him in absolute horror. "What was that?" she whispered. Draco swallowed hard. The metallic taste of blood coated his throat. "Nothing. That wasn't nothing," she said. Her voice was shaking. She raised her wand again, her hand unsteady. The diagnostic. It turned black. The spell didn't just fail, it was consumed. I've never seen anything like that. Not even during the war. It's a residual curse, Draco lied smoothly, pulling up the absolute last reserves of his occlumency. From the manor. It flares up occasionally. It's fine. A residual curse doesn't consume a diagnostic spell, Hermione argued, her brilliant mind already tearing his lie to shreds. A residual curse registers as dark magic, usually purple or deep red. Black means a void. Black means your magical core is literally collapsing in on itself. Draco didn't answer. He couldn't. She was too smart. She was always too smart. "We have to go to McGonagall," Hermione said, her panic rising. She stepped forward, reaching for his arm again. "Or St. Mungo's. You need a curse breaker." "I don't need a curse breaker," Draco said harshly. "Your blood is literally black, Malfoy," she yelled, losing her temper completely. "Stop being a stubborn idiot and let me cast the counter-curse." "There is no counter-curse." The words ripped out of his throat before he could stop them. The absolute, devastating truth hung in the freezing air between them. Hermione froze. Her hand hovered an inch from his arm. She looked at his face. She looked past the arrogant mask, past the cold indifference, and saw the utter exhaustion underneath. She saw the truth he had just accidentally confirmed. He was dying. And there was no cure. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "Malfoy, what kind of magic did you use?" Draco's chest heaved. The pain in his head was blinding. The secret was clawing at the back of his throat, desperate to get out. The urge to confess tasted like ash on his tongue. He was utterly desperate to tell her everything about the atrium, the falling stone, and the bargain he made just so she could stand here in the snow and yell at him. He couldn't. If she knew, the bargain was void. She would die all over again. He had to push her away. He had to make her hate him enough to leave it alone. He wrenched his arm out of her grip, smearing dark blood across the pristine white of her uniform. "Leave it alone, Granger," he snarled, his vision blurring at the edges. "This is the one thing you can't fix." Part 5. The truth. The first thing Draco registered was the deep, unnatural absence of pain. For 3 days, his reality had been defined by the jagged, screaming migraine tearing his skull apart from the inside. It had been a constant, deafening roar, drowning out everything else. Now, there was only silence. He lay completely still, his eyes closed, cataloguing his body. His limbs felt incredibly heavy, as if his bones had been replaced with solid lead. The air was warm. He was lying on a soft mattress, covered by a heavy duvet. He could smell wood smoke, polished mahogany, and the sharp, unmistakable scent of peppermint and old parchment. He was in his bedroom in the head's dormitories. The last thing he remembered was the freezing wind in the viaduct courtyard, the terrifying black aura of the diagnostic spell, and the absolute panic in Granger's eyes just before the darkness rose up and swallowed him whole. Draco forced his eyes open. The room was bathed in the dim, golden light of a single enchanted candle resting on the bedside table. The shadows were deep and heavy. She was sitting on the very edge of his mattress. Hermione Granger looked completely destroyed. Her Gryffindor tie was gone, her white uniform shirt unbuttoned at the collar. Her hair was a wild, chaotic halo around her face, as if she had been running her hands through it for hours. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, tracking his face with an intensity that made his breath stall in his lungs. She wasn't angry. She wasn't terrified. She looked as though someone had hollowed her out with a rusted knife. "You're awake," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly raw, completely stripped of its usual crisp authority. Draco tried to sit up. His muscles refused to obey the command. He managed to push himself up an inch before collapsing back against the pillows with a soft groan. "Don't move," Hermione said immediately, her hand hovering over his chest but not quite touching him. "Your core was nearly depleted. You've been unconscious for 14 hours. 14 hours. Draco swallowed dryly. The metallic taste of blood was gone, replaced by the lingering bitterness of a high-grade blood-replenishing potion. He needed to get his defenses up. He needed to rebuild the walls he had dropped in the snow. He was naked and exposed, lying in his own bed while the girl he had sacrificed the universe for looked at him like he was a ghost. "How did I get here?" Draco asked. His voice was a weak, rasping croak. He hated it. He tried to inject his usual drawl into the next sentence, but it fell completely flat. "I assume you didn't levitate me through the Great Hall during dinner." "I used a localized portkey," Hermione said. Her eyes didn't leave his face. "I keyed it to the head's common room. I couldn't take you to Madame Pomfrey. You told me." Her voice caught, breaking slightly before she forced it steady. "You told me it was the one thing I couldn't fix." Draco's heart gave a violent, painful lurch. She had listened to him. Even in a panic, even when she thought he was dying of a dark curse, she had trusted his final, desperate command over her own logic. "Thank you," Draco muttered, looking away from her. He looked at the heavy velvet curtains drawn across the window. "I suppose I owe you a life debt now, Granger. How deeply tragic for my family name." It was a weak deflection. A pathetic attempt to return to the script. Hermione didn't rise to the bait. She didn't snap back. She just sat there, eerily still, watching him. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Draco couldn't stand it. He preferred her yelling at him. He preferred the hostility, the suspicion, the cold indifference. Anything was better than this quiet, devastating scrutiny. "If I'm not dying," Draco said, forcing himself to look back at her, "you can go. I don't need a babysitter. You have classes to prepare for." "I'm not going anywhere," Hermione said softly. "Granger, I used Legilimency on you." The words dropped into the quiet room like a physical blow. Draco went completely, terrifyingly still. The air vanished from his lungs. The blood roaring in his ears was suddenly deafening. "You what?" he breathed. "You were dying, Malfoy." Hermione said. A single tear escaped, tracking a slow, shiny line down her pale cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. Your pulse was failing. The blood wouldn't stop. I couldn't take you to a healer, and I didn't know what kind of magic was tearing you apart. I had to know the counter-curse. I had to look. Panic, pure and absolute, clawed its way up Draco's throat. His occlumency shields. He had been unconscious. His mind had been completely unguarded, entirely defenseless. "You looked in my head?" Draco said, his voice rising, a sharp edge of genuine panic finally breaking through his facade. "Granger, that is highly illegal and incredibly rude. You erased an entire year of my life, Malfoy." Hermione shot back, her voice suddenly fierce, cracking with barely suppressed grief. "I think we're past the point of basic manners." Draco closed his eyes. The floor was gone. The sky was gone. The universe he had carefully, meticulously held together for 3 agonizing months was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. She knew. "What did you see?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. He couldn't open his eyes. He couldn't look at her. "I saw everything," Hermione said, her voice breaking again. Draco felt the mattress shift as she shifted her weight closer to him. "I went looking for a curse," she continued, the words spilling out of her in a rushed, desperate tide. "I went looking for the incantation that was causing your blood to turn black. But the moment I broke the surface of your mind, I didn't find a curse. I found a memory." Draco flinched, his hands curling into tight fists against the sheets. "I saw the library," Hermione whispered. "I saw us sitting on the floor in the restricted section, exactly like we did yesterday. But it wasn't yesterday. We were older. The war was already happening. I saw you. I saw you laughing at a joke I made about Goshawk." Draco's chest heaved. He couldn't breathe. "I saw the astronomy tower," she said, her voice dropping to a devastated hush. "I saw the stars. I felt the cold stone under my hands. I saw you looking at me like I was the only thing keeping you tethered to the earth. And then..." She stopped. She took a ragged, shuddering breath. "Don't," Draco begged. It was the first time in his life he had ever truly begged for anything. "Granger, please. Stop." "I saw the atrium," she finished, the words dropping like stones. "I saw the green light. I saw the ceiling collapsing. I felt the exact moment my heart stopped beating in your chest. Silence slammed back into the room. Draco kept his eyes tightly shut, but the tears leaked out anyway, hot and humiliating, tracking sideways across his temples and disappearing into his hair. The secret was out. The burden he had carried entirely alone for 3 months was suddenly sitting right there on the edge of his bed, looking at him with his own stolen memories. It's a delusion. Draco lied. It was a pathetic, broken lie, but it was the only weapon he had left. It's a side effect of the dark magic. A cursed memory. It isn't real. Don't do that, Hermione said fiercely. She leaned forward. Do not lie to me, Draco Malfoy. Not now. Not after what I just saw in your head. Draco opened his eyes. She was incredibly close. He could see the gold flecks in her irises, bright with unshed tears. He could see the fierce, unrelenting intelligence that had terrified him and captivated him in equal measure. You traded the timeline, she stated. It wasn't a question. You made a bargain. A forbidden ritual. You turned back time by exactly 1 year to pull me out from under that falling stone, and the price was that only you would remember the year we lost. Draco didn't move. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Why? She demanded, her voice cracking. Why would you do that? You sacrificed a year of your life. You sacrificed the end of the war. You sacrificed us. You gave up everything we built, everything we were, just to put me back here in a timeline where I hated you. Because you were dead, Hermione. Draco shouted the words. He didn't mean to, but they tore out of him, raw and bleeding, shattering the quiet of the room. Hermione flinched backward slightly, her eyes widening. Draco pushed himself up onto his elbows, ignoring the screaming protest of his exhausted muscles. He leaned toward her, his chest heaving, his grey eyes blazing with a desperate, furious grief. You were dead, he repeated, his voice dropping into a ragged, guttural rasp. I watched the light leave your eyes. I felt your pulse stop under my hands. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Hermione stood frozen, her lips parted, completely speechless. I couldn't fix it. Draco continued, the words pouring out of him now that the dam was finally broken. I tried every healing spell I knew. I tried dark magic. I tried blood magic. Nothing worked. You were gone. The brightest, most infuriating, most brilliant witch of the age was dead on the floor of the ministry, and I was entirely alone in a world that suddenly made absolutely no sense. He slumped back against the pillows, the brief burst of adrenaline leaving him hollow and shaking. So I fixed it, he whispered, looking up at the dark canopy of the bed. I found the ritual. I paid the price. I didn't care that you wouldn't remember. I didn't care that you would hate me again. I didn't care that I would have to watch you look at me with utter disdain every single day for the rest of the year. None of it mattered. As long as you were breathing, none of it mattered. Hermione was crying now. Silent tears tracked down her face, falling into her lap. It's killing you, she said, her voice shaking violently. The temporal friction. 2 realities fighting for dominance in one mind. That's why your blood turned black. The timeline is trying to erase you to fix the paradox. It's a small price to pay. Draco muttered, closing his eyes again. It is not a small price to pay. Hermione yelled, suddenly furious. She leaned forward, her hands hovering in the air between them, desperate to touch him but terrified of making the magic worse. You didn't have the right to make that choice for me, Draco. You didn't have the right to erase my memories without my permission. I would do it again, Draco said instantly. He opened his eyes and met her furious gaze with absolute, unyielding certainty. 1,000 times over. I would let the timeline tear me apart 1,000,000 times if it meant keeping you alive. Hermione searched his face. The anger in her eyes fractured, giving way to something incredibly vast and completely devastating. You stupid, arrogant, impossible boy, she breathed. I've been called worse, Draco said weakly, a tiny, self-deprecating smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. By me. Frequently. She agreed, a small, choked laugh escaping her throat. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't suffocating. It was heavy with the crushing reality of the truth, pressing down on both of them, pinning them to the mattress. The tea, Hermione said softly, looking down at the heavy duvet covering his legs. In the common room. You knew exactly how I took it. Muscle memory, Draco admitted softly. I made it for you every night during the winter we were hiding in the Forest of Dean. And the book in the library. Goshawk. You threw it at my head in the erased timeline. I was trying to save you the trouble of finding it. Hermione looked back up at him. You caught the mug before it fell because you knew I was going to knock it over. You always knock things over when you're stressed about irreversible, Draco said gently. I know all your patterns, Hermione. I know you chew the inside of your cheek when you're lying. I know you tap your quill 3 times before conceding an argument. I know exactly how you breathe when you're pretending to be asleep. Hermione's breath hitched. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He knew her soul. He knew her better than she knew herself, and he had been carrying that knowledge alone, buried under a mask of cold hostility, while she treated him like the enemy. I'm sorry. She whispered. Draco frowned. What for? For looking at you the way I did, she said, her voice trembling. For hating you. For making this so much harder for you than it already was. You didn't know, Draco said. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly, and let his fingers brush against the rough wool of her skirt. You weren't supposed to know. That was the whole point of the bargain. Well, the bargain is broken now. Hermione said firmly, swiping a hand across her wet cheeks, her practical, problem-solving nature violently reasserting itself. The paradox is destabilizing because you're holding a reality that doesn't exist anymore. But it does exist. I saw it. It's in my head now too. Draco recoiled slightly. Granger. No. You can't. I already did, she said stubbornly. I saw the memories. They're mine now. Which means you aren't holding the paradox alone anymore. She moved. She shifted her weight, leaning fully onto the bed, invading his space completely. Draco braced himself for the spike of pain. Whenever she got too close, the temporal friction usually flared, punishing him for brushing against the life he had stolen back. It didn't happen. Hermione reached out. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. The touch was electric, but it didn't burn. It didn't tear at his mind. Instead, a massive, heavy wave of absolute calm settled into his bones. The lingering tension in his muscles, the dull ache in his bones, the frantic buzzing at the edges of his consciousness, it all vanished. Draco gasped, his eyes flying wide. "Do you feel it?" Hermione asked, her eyes fixed on his face, her hands pressing firmly against his chest. "The pain," Draco breathed, completely stunned. "It's gone." "The paradox is stabilizing," Hermione said, her voice laced with wonder. "The time turner magic was tearing you apart because it was trying to erase a reality that only existed in one place. It was a closed loop of temporal friction. But now we share it," Draco finished, staring at her hands resting over his heart. He looked up at her face. She was so close he could see the individual lashes framing her dark eyes. He could see the tears still shining on her cheeks. He could feel the warmth of her palms seeping through his shirt, anchoring him to the mattress, anchoring him to the present, anchoring him to her. "We share it," Hermione agreed softly. She slid her hands slowly upward. She traced the line of his collarbone, her touch feather-light, before cupping his jaw in both of her palms. Draco's eyes fluttered shut. He leaned into her touch, a small, involuntary sigh escaping his lips. It had been so long. So incredibly, agonizingly long since he had allowed himself to feel the warmth of her hands on his skin. "I remember the astronomy tower," she whispered, her thumbs brushing gently across his cheekbones. "I remember the way the stars looked. I remember exactly how cold the stone was." Draco opened his eyes. "You saw the memory. It's not the same." "It's close enough," Hermione said fiercely. "It's a starting point." She leaned down. She didn't kiss him. She simply rested her forehead against his, closing the final, impossible distance between them. Draco's hands moved of their own accord. He reached up, tangling his fingers in the messy, chaotic curls at the nape of her neck. He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of vanilla and old parchment and the freezing November air she had brought in from the courtyard. She laced her fingers through his, pressing her palm against the frantic beat of his pulse. And for the first time since he woke up in a timeline that didn't belong to him, Draco finally stopped fighting and just let himself fall. Part 6. The epilogue. The June sun was blindingly bright, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked pavement of platform 9 3/4. The air smelled of coal smoke, expensive perfume, and the desperate, frantic energy of hundreds of students realizing they were finally going home. Draco Malfoy leaned comfortably against a wrought iron pillar, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the chaos unfold. He was wearing a light grey suit, the Slytherin tie discarded hours ago. He looked healthy. The unnatural, sallow grey tone had vanished from his skin 6 months ago, taking the blinding migraines and the terrifying black nosebleeds with it. He was perfectly fine. The temporal paradox had never truly vanished, but it had stabilized. It lived between them now, a quiet, shared weight. Every time she held his hand, every time she pressed her shoulder against his in the library, every time she looked at him and simply remembered, the friction eased. She had taken half the burden of the erased timeline, weaving his stolen memories into her own mind until the universe simply accepted that they were both right. It had taken time. It hadn't been easy. She had spent the first month of the new year fiercely interrogating him about every single detail of the lost timeline, demanding to know every conversation they had ever had, refusing to let him carry a single secret alone. Then, slowly, they had started building new ones. It began with small things, studying together in the 8th-year common room without starting a screaming match, taking walks around the newly rebuilt Black Lake, sitting close enough at dinner that their knees brushed under the table. Draco had spent the entire year bracing for the inevitable moment when she would realize he was irreparably broken, a boy dragging the ghost of a dead timeline behind him like a chain. But she hadn't. Instead, Hermione had simply reached down, picked up the chain, and started pulling it with him. They were a terrifying, unstoppable force, bound together by a secret that no one else in the world could ever possibly understand. Oi! Malfoy! Draco didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head toward the crimson gleam of the Hogwarts Express. Theodore Nott was leaning out of a window halfway down the train, waving a violently green scarf like a distress flag. If you don't get on the train in the next 3 minutes, I am claiming the entire compartment for myself and locking the door. Theo shouted over the roar of the crowd. Do it, Nott. Draco called back, his voice completely level. I'll just hex the hinges off. Theo grinned, entirely unfazed. The last 6 months had been remarkably kind to him, too. Without the looming threat of the Dark Lord or the crushing weight of their father's expectations, Theo had reverted to the chaotic, brilliant idiot he was always meant to be. You're getting soft, mate. He yelled happily. I preferred you when you were terrifying and brooding in corners. It gave me a lot more room to stretch my legs in the common room. I'll practice my glaring on the ride back. Draco shouted. You do that. Theo yelled, dodging a parsing third year. And tell Granger to hurry up. I'm not playing Exploding Snap by myself for 8 hours. Theo disappeared back into the train carriage, his loud, barking laugh echoing over the platform. Draco shook his head, a genuine, easy smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. His right, you know. The voice came from his left. Draco turned, the smile instantly softening into something entirely different. Something guarded, private, and fiercely devoted. Hermione Granger was standing 3 feet away, glaring at him with a mixture of deep exhaustion and quiet affection. She was a vision of absolute, magnificent chaos. She was wearing a light blue summer dress that was already slightly wrinkled, likely because she had spent the last 2 hours frantically tearing apart the head's dorm looking for missing quill. Her hair was a wild, untamable cloud of brown curls escaping a haphazard ribbon, framing a face that still made his breath catch in his throat every single time he looked at her. She was dragging a heavy leather trunk with one hand, balancing a precarious stack of 3 massive books against her hip, and carrying a violently overstuffed beaded bag over her opposite shoulder. I'm not getting soft, Draco informed her, stepping away from the pillar. You smiled, Hermione pointed out, struggling to adjust her grip on the leather trunk. At a public train station, while talking to Theodore Nott. That's basically the Slytherin equivalent of writing a sappy poem. I'll try to be more menacing on the train. Draco promised. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't ask. He simply reached out and plucked the 3 massive books from her hip, tucking them smoothly under his left arm. I am perfectly capable of carrying my own bags, Malfoy, Hermione said, though she didn't actually try to take the books back. I know, Granger, Draco said smoothly. He reached out with his right hand and caught the strap of the heavily beaded bag resting on her shoulder. But if I let you carry this one, the strap will snap in exactly 4 steps, and I don't feel like picking irreversible textbooks off the platform. Hermione frowned at him, her brown eyes narrowing slightly. You couldn't possibly know that. The stitching on the front buckle is completely frayed, Draco said, lifting the bag slightly to show her the worn leather. And you have roughly 40 pounds of books in here. It's simple physics. It's magic, she corrected defensively. I cast an undetectable extension charm on it. And you clearly forgot to cast a reinforcement charm on the strap, he countered. He slid the bag off her shoulder and slung it effortlessly over his own, ignoring the heavy, unnatural weight of it. Hermione let out a small, frustrated sigh, but she didn't argue. She stepped closer to him, the chaotic energy draining out of her, leaving her looking tired but deeply content. You're infuriating, she murmured, looking up at him. It's part of my undeniable charm, Draco replied. He shifted his weight, freeing his right hand entirely. He reached out and caught her hand. Her fingers immediately laced through his, holding on tight. Her palm was warm. A familiar, electric current of her magic brushed against his skin, settling deep into his chest, quiet and anchoring. They stood there for a moment in the middle of the crowded platform, surrounded by the noise of students and parents and the screeching whistle of the train. It was loud. It was messy. It was everything the erased timeline hadn't been. Are you ready? Hermione asked softly. Draco looked at her. He saw the faint, fading scars of the war on her arms, the lingering shadows of exhaustion under her eyes from staying up too late studying for their NEWTS, and the fierce, brilliant light that had anchored him to the earth through 2 entirely different lifetimes. She was brilliant. She was maddening. She was entirely, inexplicably his. Yes, Draco said, the single word carrying the gravity of a vow. He pulled her slightly closer, ducking his head to press a brief, firm kiss to her temple. The scent of vanilla and ink filled his lungs, erasing the last lingering traces of the dark timeline. She leaned into it, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second before she smiled against his jaw. Come on, she said, tugging on his hand. Before Theo actually barricades the door. He followed her onto the train, the whistle blowing loud and clear. They were leaving the castle, leaving the war, and stepping into a future that finally belonged to both of them.